Sure.
Just ignore me.
Okay, that's good. Good evening. Good evening and welcome to UCLA. I'm Ted Parson. I'm a professor at the law school here at UCLA, and I'm the faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. We're here tonight for what I hope is going to be a really stimulating and exciting conversation about whether and how it's possible to hold fossil fuel companies liable for the harms that climate change is inflicting on communities, already inflicting, and with the prospect of more severe to come. The Emmett Institute is delighted to be a co-host, convener, and sponsor of tonight's event. The Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA Law School is the leading law school center focused on climate change and other critical environmental issues, and we are thrilled to be celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. Thank you, Dan. The Emmett Institute's dozen-odd faculty, fellows, and staff work across disciplines to advance law and policy solutions on climate change and other environmental challenges through research and scholarship, through our engagement in legal and policy action, and through outreach and communications, such as the event tonight. We also train students to become the next generation of environmental leaders, some of whom are tonight serving as volunteers to help run this event, so thank you, students. The Emmett Institute is especially delighted to be co-hosting this event with our friends from the Distinguished Scientific and Environmental Group, the Union of Concerned Scientists. Founded in 1969, the Union, UCS, develops and implements innovative practical solutions to some of the planet's most pressing problems, from combating global warming to developing sustainable ways to feed, power, and transport ourselves, to fighting misinformation and the misuse of science, to advancing racial equity and reducing the threat of nuclear war. That's a full plate. The Emmett Institute and UCS have a rich and rewarding partnership. This is the third public event that we've co-sponsored. Actually, we're excited tonight to be welcoming back Ken Kimmel, who is the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists and one of UCLA Law School's distinguished alumni. Hi, Ken, welcome. I also have the honor to serve on UCS's National Advisory Board. We're also grateful to the UCLA Center for Climate Science and the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability for their co-sponsorship of tonight's event. Now, I'm going to take a moment to give you a brief preview of the event and then introduce our first couple of speakers, and then we'll have a continuing handoff of responsibility over the course of the evening. Communities in America and also worldwide are facing a diverse array of increasingly severe risks from climate change. Not just higher temperatures, but rising sea levels, disruption of seasonal weather patterns, and increased occurrence of extreme events of all kinds, from heat waves to tropical storms, wildfires, floods, and droughts. Yes, you can have more of both, and a wide range of ecological, economic, and community impacts. After the past 2 months or so, I don't think I need to tell anybody in LA or in Southern California to remind them about climate change or about the vulnerability of everyone and every community. So far, this should be familiar and worrisome. Tonight, we're talking about something that's relatively new and kind of hopeful. Legal experts are now seriously exploring whether and how it's possible to hold fossil fuel companies liable for the harms that their products, via climate change, are inflicting on communities around the country and around the world. The city of Richmond announced a new lawsuit on Tuesday, which makes it the 9th California city and county to bring suit for climate damages. And earlier this month, on the 10th of January, New York City filed a suit for climate damages. And 2 city council members in Los Angeles have announced that they're exploring the possibility of a suit from LA. The fossil fuel producers, the targets of these suits, unsurprisingly, are fighting back. Exxon is threatening to countersue in California and has begun a series of procedural maneuvers that are likely to be time-consuming and costly for the cities and counties that are the plaintiffs. So we're here tonight to talk about the science and the legal issues and the legal strategy that are behind these lawsuits, and their outlook and their prospects for success. We're excited to have a terrific collection of speakers and panelists to guide us through these questions. We're going to first hear some remarks from the Honorable Cristina Garcia, Assemblymember for California's 58th District. Then we'll have a keynote address from Bill McKibben via a live video link, followed by presentations from Peter Frumhoff of the Union of Concerned Scientists and my UCLA law colleague Ann Carlson, and then a panel discussion which my other UCLA law colleague Kara Horowitz is going to lead, that will include Peter, Anne, as well as Mayor Serge Dedino of Imperial Beach, and Gladys Limon, the Executive Director of Communities for a Better Environment. Then we'll invite questions and discussion from the audience before a brief closing and a call to action by Ken Kimmel, President of UCS. We'll wrap up at 8 o'clock and then have the opportunity to move to more informal. Thank you. And Alex Hall, terrific. Late addition or glitch in the preparation of talking notes, who knows, but that's great. We'll wrap up around 8 and move to informal conversations. So, first up is Cristina Garcia. Assemblymember Cristina Garcia has served in the State Assembly since she was elected in 2012, representing the 58th District that comprises 9 cities in southeastern Los Angeles, southeastern metropolitan Los Angeles. Before being elected, she was a community organizer and a civic activist, and is now widely viewed as a member of a new generation of leaders in the California legislature, often described as a force of nature. Cristina serves as the chair of the Assembly Committee on Natural Resources, as well as serving on the committees for Judiciary, Ethics, Environmental Safety and Toxics, Utility and Energy, and the Budget Subcommittee for Resources and Transportation. Another full plate. She has long been a staunch and effective advocate for environmental justice and for disadvantaged communities. She was instrumental in securing funding for the cleanup of man-made environmental disasters like Exxon. She's a fighter for tougher air quality standards like those that are embodied in the bill AB 617. She's fought for the ability to stop emissions that represent particularly imminent and dangerous threats to public health. And she's pressed for small communities to get a fair share of investment in transport and infrastructure to get cleaner buses running and electric vehicles running on the streets in southeastern Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Assemblymember Cristina Garcia.
Thank you for that great introduction. And it's nice that you started off with such a great introduction, because I'm going to talk about the shortcomings of being a legislator and how we don't always get it right and how we fail. Anyway, we need the legal experts to be our allies and go forward with lawsuits like this to help us be our partners in change. So I'll share a little bit of my stories. And so while I'm a force, it's a force that sometimes you fail forward along the way. And so I hope the main thing you take away is that while we get to have fancy titles, we don't always do it right, but U.S. legal experts help us do it better and help take care of communities like mine along the way. And so thank you for that. I want to begin by thanking the Union of Concerned Scientists for inviting me here, also for being allies every step of the way on whatever I've needed since I've been in the legislature. I also want to thank the Emmett Institute and my friends at UCLA for hosting. And I want to take a moment and actually give a shout out to Sean Hedge, who has done a lot of work with myself in my office in these fights, who I had never met. And today finally got to meet him in person. We've had lots of phone calls, but picked up the phone one day and he's been there every step of the way. And so I do want to take a moment to thank you for all the work you've done with myself and on behalf of my communities. And so, as you heard, I represent the 58th District. And let me give you a little bit of background of why I am who I am. I am not a scientist, and I only play an attorney on the Judiciary Committee. I am a math nerd by trade, but I grew up in a community of working class community where there's a lot of resilience, community of immigrants that came here with nothing and deal with a lot of issues every day, but in spite of that, we get to become legislators one day. But I have a community that I often describe by the 6 freeways that choke my district and all the diseases that come with that. I also have a district that has been treated like a wasteland. So I have lead exposure, I have arsenic, My sister and I always joke that we would be geniuses if we didn't grow up where we did, because we're sure that we are radioactive in here, given where we grew up and where I now live again. I live in the city of Bell Gardens again, where I grew up, and I've been there for the last 8-9 years. And I think about, the trade-offs to my health being there. And I have the luxury to walk away one day if I want, but most of my neighbors don't have that luxury. And so that's a little bit of what drives me and why I have been that fighter, and I try to elevate that environmental justice, because we have had lots of great policies that California gets to be proud of, but oftentimes it's left communities like mine behind, and we haven't gotten our piece of the pie. We haven't had our justice. And some of my peers in the Capitol cringe when I say this, because I talk about environmental, trickle-down environmentalism. But that's what it has felt like, because these policies have always left us behind, and I've always been told, stop saying that, like, you're going to catch up eventually, but we haven't caught up in my life. And so it just speaks to how this process is not great, how legislation is sloppy, and how we don't always get it right. But with our different partners, including the legal field, we can do it better for these communities that have been left behind for so long. And so I hope you leave inspired, because I'm going to tell you a little bit about our cap and trade policies that were just adopted in my Clean Air bill, and we've had a lot of accolades. But it's not lost on me how imperfect it is, and as a legislator, I need to compromise. And for a legislator who is coming from a community that has never gotten anything, I'm going to take what I can for now. But it's not lost on me the shortcomings that we have and the work that we have to do to eventually do it right for everyone along the way. And so I want to take a little bit about time to share my experience about cap and trade this last year. And a lot of you in this room were involved with that fight. And I am proud of the work. At the end of the day, I go to sleep just fine, because I do think I got a pretty good deal given where I started. But it's not lost on me the work that I still have to do with all of you hand in hand. So I also, I should look at my notes. My staff did some great notes for me. I also want to point out that my district not only has the freeways, but it's just a concrete jungle in general. The only outdoors that we really get to enjoy is the LA River. And most of you have driven by that LA River, and it's not really a great outdoors. It's a bunch of dirty concrete. That becomes a heat island for us most of the year. And so that's the other thing that I wanted to give you. Okay. So let me start with my story. Last year, I introduced AB 378. Which would have taken cap and trade and linked it to clean air. And it would have said that you're only eligible to get clean air if you meet certain standards, and we're taking into that social cost, and you're paying for those social costs either by reducing your emissions or some other way. And so it was a way to move the discussion and ensure that clean air is going to be part of the discussion, and these communities were going to be at the table. When we started the discussion, folks like the scientists came to the table and said, okay, well, this is a little different, but we're down to be part of this game. The EJ community came on board to try to do this. And I will say most folks were skeptical. They're like, we're not going to get this done unless just oppose cap and trade. And I came with a really different perspective of the governor is actually the real force of nature. And I've been there long enough, and I haven't seen him fail. And he will do whatever he has to do and barter with whoever he has to get a deal done. So I was going to force my way as the chair of natural resources. I had something unique that I hadn't had before, and it was that chairmanship. And his cap and trade legislation was going to come through me. And so I was going to hold them hostage as long as possible. And so while folks were a little skeptical in the room, they were going to come along for the ride, maybe not because of my passion, but because I was the chair. And they kind of had no choice. But we actually, little by little, did start to elevate the discussion of environmental justice and the discussion of clean air. And the fact that when we passed AB 32, in there it said that we were not going to do any more harm to these communities, and we were going to do clean air. But the science tells us that we haven't done any of that, actually. In communities like mine, it's gotten worse over the last 10 years. And so my bill died. I couldn't get 41 votes, much less the 54 votes that the governor wanted. And so what I thought was something really simple, on the floor I was told that clean air wasn't that important and my communities were not that important. I was literally told that by one of my members that rose their mic to speak about how it was a good idea to kill my bill and we should only be doing cap and trade. And so in that process, I was losing my leverage, and I had to figure out other ways to keep myself at the table and keep this issue alive. And we got creative, and we partnered up with folks who wanted housing. We partnered up with folks that wanted some additional stuff in cap and trade, which I hadn't been fighting for. It had been all about the clean air and social costs for me. But I was like, sure, I will be the champion for that now suddenly. And we did get a cap and trade bill passed, and we did get a quality air quality bill that has both deadlines, enforcement, and other mechanisms to start to change things forward. I've also been very clear that it's just a down payment and it's just one tool in the toolkit we need to build because it's not going to solve all my problems. But we're starting from nothing, so I'm proud of that work. But in order to get that bill and to get that money that we did also along the way, I had to compromise a lot on cap and trade. And the people that benefited the most are the oil companies. And so in the legislature, we did a decent job, but it was incomplete. And the special interests that we're here to talk about is who got the biggest pass. But we also know that they are perpetuating and are some of the biggest contributors, not just to the air quality issues in my community, but also to our climate change that's so detrimental to the whole planet out there. And so I think we should celebrate ourselves for a second, but we should stop and say, hey, these are my shortcomings. And I hope through the experts you have here, you all walk away ready to file some more lawsuits and hold some people accountable, because that is another great way to make legislation in a different style. So a little bit about what we gave away. I'm not going to talk about everything that I got in 617, because I'm here to inspire you that we weren't perfect in what we gave away. A little bit about the cap and trade bill. So let me tell you what it does. It requires ARB to establish a price ceiling on emissions allowances, which must consider the full social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. It reduces the limits on offsets and requires at least half of the offsets must provide direct benefits to California. Sorry about that, communities. Offsets are part of this market mechanism, but in reality, it means that they can continue to pollute in communities like mine. We're paying to pollute, and we're feeling good about ourselves because we're like, oh, well, I'm doing something in Brazil. And I want you to do something in Brazil, but I also want you to do something in Mill Gardens. I want you to do both. But that's part of that compromise along the way. It requires ARB to consider the potential for a border carbon adjustment as an alternative to allowance allocations to address the risk of leakage. And so sources of greenhouse gas emissions moving to another state or county that does not have the same strict climate rules as California. We've heard a lot about businesses leaving, and sometimes I'm going to tell you the truth, and it doesn't make many friends. Some of these businesses need to leave my backyard because there's really no solution to it along the way. But we do worry about that. Those are jobs. Oftentimes, those are labor jobs, quality jobs, and so that is part of what my peers are worried about. And so in doing that, we find other ways to actually continue to give a benefit to the oil companies along the way with our cap and trade bill. Lastly, the legislature expressed its intention that the state auction revenues for the program be spent in a manner that prioritizes actions that will reduce air pollution and improve communities. In 617 and the $300 million we got to begin with to implement 617 is part of that. But we doled out over $1 billion. And so let me tell a little bit more about where those $1 billion are going and how a big chunk of that is actually going to the oil industry in lots of different ways. So the oil industry maintains 100% assistance factors through 2030. And so a cap and trade idea is that I'm going to give you less over time, and my assistance to you is less, and you're going to change your operation. But the oil industry is the only industry that got this 100% allowance through 2030. Everyone else will have a real cap and trade program, but not the oil industries out there. It requires ARB to designate the cap and trade regulation as a rule for petroleum refineries and oil and gas production facilities to achieve their greenhouse gas emissions. So basically what this does is eliminates the 20% emission reductions for oil refineries proposed by ARB in the initial scoping plan. So we started off the year with our regulatory body saying this is what you need to do, and they were fighting back. But through legislation, we clawed back what the regulatory agency was going to do, and we said, it's okay, you don't have to do that either. Everyone else is supposed to, but we're going to continue to give you this pass. And it also prohibits local air districts from adopting or implementing any additional emission rules that affects the oil industry. Out there. And so local agencies are able to do more beyond what the state did, but we limited their power here, preempting what the city of San Francisco was doing, what the Bay Area was doing, because they have a lot of refineries that they're dealing with out there. And so it's a pretty incomplete bill out there. And so while I'm proud of the work we did and I have to compromise as the legislature, I think there's a lot of things that I hope you guys find ways to sue on to hold these oil companies accountable. In addition to those giveaways, we gave financial giveaways to these companies also along the way. And we also gave money away for other things. The Republicans, the governor today in the State of the Union boasted about the Republicans that voted for cap and trade and how we were able to be bipartisan as opposed to what's happening in D.C. But those bipartisan votes came with a lot of cost. monies that I think should be going to communities that are most impacted, but are not necessarily going to be going there. We have suspended the state responsibility area fire prevention fee for rural homeowners, and cap and trade is going to replace those dollars. We extended an existing sales tax exemption for manufacturers through 2030 and brought in eligible investments to include electric power and agricultural business activities. And that will also be paid from our cap and trade revenues. And so while we did move the ball forward, there were a lot of compromises to get this deal done and a lot of giveaways to a lot of different folks, including our oil industry individuals out there. And so is the fossil fuel really on the hook for climate change? Did we really do our job at the legislature? I think for a lot of industries we have, but when it comes to the oil industry, we have not. And so we need our partners in the legal community. We need our activists out there to make sure we are holding them accountable. So I'm excited about the work that's happening here today. I'm excited that we're leveraging these tools that are in an institution like UCLA with the attorneys to find other creative ways to make sure that the work that the legislature did incompletely gets done better. Because the people that suffer the most, yes, we all suffer. And you see communities like Montecito and Napa suffering right now in the media every day with the fires and with the floods, and that's all connected to climate change. But the communities that suffer the most are communities like mine, our low-income communities, working-class communities that are not just dealing with with climate change, but are dealing with generations of being treated like wastelands, that have these concrete jungles that already have them pretty hot to begin with in the summer days, but with climate change, that's only going to get worse. And we also know that as climate change gets worse, so does our air quality in these communities. And so kids like myself who are growing up and playing like I did next to the freeways, I hope that for them we do it better, because I hope that they don't no longer have to have the same silly jokes that my sister and I have about being geniuses if we didn't grow up there. And so I want them to have the same air quality and the same health benefits that folks in Malibu have or in the mountains have, because they are just as worthy. And it's not that I don't want to do good for those communities, but I want to say that we could do good globally while we're thinking locally, and we're identifying hotspots and we're addressing these needs in my community. And so I hope I started off with a great introduction about how I am so great, but I hope through that I remind you that the legislature is built on 120 human individuals with a lot of different interests, and we have to compromise to get something done, but we do it imperfectly, and so we need you in this room to help us do it better through your efforts. And so again, thank you all for having me. Thank you all for giving me the time to share my story. But more importantly, thank you on the behalf of my community and communities like mine who need you every day to make sure that we are healthier and we are living longer like everyone else.
Thanks so much, Cristina, for sharing your story and for your inspiring opening to our event. Next up, we have a keynote address via live video link from the distinguished author and environmentalist Bill McKibben. Bill is now the Schumann Distinguished Scholar of Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. Right after college, he spent 5 years as a staff writer at The New Yorker, and then, after leaving The New Yorker, in 1989 published his book, The End of Nature, the first book written for a general audience on climate change, now translated into 24 languages. It's easy in retrospect to forget how prescient this was. In 1988 and 1989, there was essentially no awareness of climate change outside of a few small communities of scientists and environmental activist groups. And it burst onto the agenda roughly at the same time as Bill wrote this book. He's since gone on to write a dozen more books and rack up a remarkable array of other achievements as an environmentalist as well as an author. He's one of the founders of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement, which I was astonished to learn when reading up for this, has now organized more than 20,000 citizen rallies around the world on climate change in every country of the world except North Korea. Bill was a leader in the Keystone Pipeline resistance. He helped to launch the fossil divestment movement. He continues to write, as well as his activism, for a wide range of publications from his home in the mountains above Lake Champlain. He's collected more honors and awards than it is possible for me to list, of which I will selectively note two. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, often called the Alternative Nobel Prize. And in the same year, 2014, a group of biologists honored him by naming a new species of woodland gnat in his honor, Megophthalmidia McKibbeni. Is Bill ready to go on the video link?
Indeed.
Yes. Please join me in welcoming remotely Bill McKibben.
Thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm very, very grateful for that you're willing to indulge me appearing this way. I'd much rather be there with you, of course, and not only because it's 16 below zero tonight in Vermont, but also because there's a lot to be said for getting to be in person with people. On the other hand, we need to get used, I think, to using some of these low-carbon tools that are at our disposal, and so I'm grateful to you for your indulgence here. And I was so grateful to get to hear Assemblywoman Garcia's address, which was just a good reminder that it's a bad idea to be generally cynical about politicians the way we sometimes get. Thank you, Assemblywoman, for your work very, very much. Now, I'm not a lawyer. The furthest thing from it, I mean, my main experiences with the legal system, I'm afraid, have involved going to jail now a number of times in the course of my work over the last few years. So I'm not able to tell you how these legal suits are going to come out. You'll have a much better sense of that than me. But I can tell you why they are so crucial, and that's what I want to talk about just briefly tonight. When The End of Nature came out in 1989, which means that it will be 30 years old as of next year, which means I feel very old. When it first came out, it didn't occur to me that it would be as hard as it has been to get real action on climate change. I mean, I was 27 at the time, so my theory of change, as it were, was people will read my book and then they will change. That turns out not really to be how change is accomplished, but I continued to think that it would be a process of scientists telling us what was going on, people writing books, holding seminars, talking to politicians, and before long, our system would begin to react. When our system didn't react, I began to understand how mistaken I had been, but it took me too long to reach that realization. I had thought that we were engaged in an argument about climate change, a debate, and that, you know, as a writer and as an academic, the way that we do that is to just produce more books and so on. It became clear to me that we were not engaged in an argument about climate change, that the argument had been over since at least the mid-1990s when scientists reached a robust and workable consensus. We weren't engaged in an argument, we were engaged in a fight. And the fight was, as fights are always, about money and about power. And that there was another side in this fight, and that side was the fossil fuel industry, which was clearly willing to use its money and power, unrivaled because it was the richest industry that the world has ever seen, was willing to use it to preserve its business model, even at the expense of breaking the planet. Now, we knew 10, 15 years ago that the fossil fuel industry was behaving irresponsibly. I wrote a kind of important article 6 or 7 years ago now that kind of launched the divestment movement and the Keep It in the Ground campaigns, or helped to do so, pointing out that the fossil fuel industry had in its reserves 5 times as much carbon as any scientist thought we could safely burn and meet any of the targets that we've set internationally in places like Paris. What we didn't know was that irresponsibility actually was aggressive dishonesty. It was only about 3 years ago that great journalists, including some at the LA Times, managed to uncover in archives and through whistleblowers the paper trail that proved beyond any doubt that the biggest fossil fuel companies, Exxon in particular, knew everything that there was to know about climate change 30 years ago. And in retrospect, it stands to reason that they would. They were the richest companies on Earth. They had great scientific staffs. Their product was carbon. Of course, they would investigate. Their scientists told them precisely what would happen, and their management understood and believed them. We know that because they took actions like raising the heights of drilling platforms that they were constructing in order to compensate for the sea level rise they knew would come, or preparing to bid for leases in the Arctic that they knew would eventually actually quickly melt. But they did not tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they helped bankroll the architecture of denial and deceit and disinformation that has kept us mired in a debate for 30 years about whether global warming was real or not. A debate that we now understand both sides in the debate knew from the beginning the answer to. It's just one of them wasn't telling the truth. So, as we began to understand that we needed to confront this power, and we needed to do it with more than more books, that's why we started trying to build a climate movement to seek a countervailing power. Since it wasn't going to come from money, it would have to come from someplace else. American history, world history suggests that that's by organizing large numbers of people, and in extreme and exceptional circumstances, that can provide the necessary power base. And so that's what we've tried to do. 350 it's a decade old now, and it has grown large, and we've done a lot of things over that decade, and some of them have worked well. But we're obviously still losing this fight because the planet gets warmer with each passing year. We continue to expand the fight in all the ways that we can. At the moment, of course, in the United States, some of those ways are difficult. Washington is closed off because of the political power of the fossil fuel industry to any real legislative progress. And so we find other ways to work. On on the 31st, so a week, next Wednesday in Washington, will be live streamed around the country to hundreds of watch parties, where we will lay out kind of plan for, as we see it, across a wide scope of the climate justice movement for the next few years. And it comes in 3 parts, none of which depend on real progress in DC. The first is the continued push towards 100% renewable power everywhere. Cities and states are signing up in large numbers now to move in that direction. And it's good to see. And it's good to see it coming from all kinds of cities. One would have expected the Berkeleys and the Madisons of the world to get on board, and indeed they have. But also the Pittsburghs, also the Atlantas, and Salt Lake Cities, St. Louis, headquarters to the 2 largest remaining coal companies in the U.S., has announced that it is moving towards 100% renewable energy. And that's important because it helps bolster the move, the sort of underlying technologies that we need. As you know, this week the Trump administration did its best to dampen the move towards solar power by imposing a tariff on incoming solar panels. We need lots of demand built in order to make sure that the momentum in that direction continues. The second bucket of work is this work to keep fossil fuel in the ground. It's the work that we helped kick off with the fight against the Keystone Pipeline, but that now is extended to every single new fossil fuel infrastructure project almost anywhere in the world, anywhere at least that people have the freedom to protest and get in the way. And an extraordinary number of those efforts are now successful. On the west coast of the United States, plans for 6 giant coal ports and an enormous oil terminal, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, have been beaten over the last few years by great organizing. They continue there in California. California has done a really good job of beginning to address the demand side of the climate equation, to figure out how we're going to produce cleaner energy, use less of it. Its policies and its tech leadership are remarkable to behold. What California has done nothing about is the supply side of the equation. And so you have the anachronism of people continuing to pump for oil, sometimes right next to schools and houses, and I'm sure in places not that different from the ones that Assemblywoman Garcia represents. That's crazy, and we hope very much that we can persuade, before he leaves office, Governor Browne to cement his legacy as a climate leader by taking that seriously. The third bucket of work is to figure out how to break the chain of money that allows the fossil fuel industry to keep doing what it's doing. So people are doing very good jobs in convincing cities, towns, and individuals, say, to withdraw their deposits from those banks that finance things like the Dakota Access Pipeline. The biggest example of this is the divestment movement, modeled on the one that helped break us free of apartheid in South Africa a generation ago. But in this case, by this point, much larger. We're closing in on $6 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios. And of course, there's been a big, big boost in the last couple of months. In November, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the biggest pool of investment capital on planet Earth, began its divestment. 10 days ago, the city of New York took that same step, and Bill de Blasio, its mayor, really deserves recognition as a great climate leader as a result. Not only because he started divesting New York City's $200 billion in holdings, but also because at the same time, he said that New York was going to engage in this lawsuit against the 5 biggest oil companies. It's extremely important, among other things, because of the size of New York. At the press conference where this was announced, one of the union leaders in attendance said, you know what, we've looked into this, and other people, of course, have sued in the past. The city of town of Kivalina in Alaska with 300 or 400 residents, or a couple of the very small Pacific Island nations in danger of disappearing beneath the waves. But they were pretty easy for the fossil fuel industry to squash. He said, let them try to squash New York. The same thing has to be, we've got to get Los Angeles on board, joining San Francisco and Imperial City and Oakland and now Richmond and others in this fight. The reason that it's so important is not because, as I say, I can't tell you whether the cases are going to win in the end or not. I trust in your abilities to try and make that happen. But it's incredibly important to be in court as much as possible and as powerfully as possible for a number of reasons. One is simply to continue the process of discovery and help us understand the history of the most important thing that's ever happened on this planet, the destruction of its climate system. The other is to continue to add to this unrelenting pressure in every direction on this most irresponsible of industries. In effect, to win the various legislative fights that we face, and in the ways that Assemblywoman Garcia was referring to, one of the things that we must do is break the political power of this industry. And one of the ways that we do that, as, for example, with the tobacco industry before it, is to make sure that its transgressions are in public view at all times, that it feels the pressure that it should, and that investors and others are forced to calculate as they consider this industry what its possible outcomes will be. Let me finish just by saying the only thing about legal approaches that worries me is the speed with which they operate. Our legal systems are slow often, and slowness is the one thing that we cannot afford in this fight. Every other fight for social justice that we undertake, we have the sense that eventually we will prevail. And that's a very good and optimistic sense to be able to have. Dr. King would end every talk by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. We do not have that comfort in this fight. The arc of the physical universe appears to be short, and it bends toward heat. If we do not win soon, then we will not win. So as you contemplate legal strategies, make sure that that's part of the contemplation. 75 years from now, this world will be powered by solar panels and wind turbines and the like. The question is whether the world that they power will be a broken world or not. And if we do not move very quickly, that is precisely what will happen. So I just want to bring you the deepest thanks from all around the planet, because we work all over the planet, but the legal profession is joining now in this fight in a really unprecedented and powerful way. Your work is absolutely essential to where we're going, and know that we look on with admiration and stand ready to help in any of the ways that might be useful to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bill, for those inspiring remarks. And now, can you see the grand plan emerging? We're moving toward increasing granularity and detail as we get into how it would actually work. And to take us the next steps in those directions, in that direction, we're going to have some remarks from Peter Fromhoff and Carlson. I'll introduce the two of you both together and then step off, and then I hand off authority from here. Peter is the Director of Science and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists and also its Chief Climate Scientist. He guides organization-wide strategies to bring scientific expertise to bear on public understanding and public policies. He's trained as a global change ecologist, and he's published and lectured widely on scientific topics and on policy topics, and increasingly recently on the question we're focused on tonight, legal accountability of fossil fuel companies. I've personally had the pleasure of working with Peter since 1988. I met him in my first year of graduate school. Ann Carlson is the Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law here at UCLA School of Law, and she is my faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. She's one of the country's leading experts and scholars on climate change law and policy. She's also on the faculty at the UCLA Institute of the Environment. Are we going Peter and then Ann, or Ann then Peter? Okay, so Peter, over to you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Ted, and thank you especially to Assemblywoman Garcia and to Bill McKibben for creating that powerful platform on which this conversation can now build. If I can get these slides to move. Let's see. That's not working, so let's try this. That's not working either. No, I don't think you did. I'll take responsibility, but it's not functioning. Any? Thank you. Oh, it wasn't just me, Chris. Great. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm based at the headquarters of the Union of Concerned Scientists in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I grew up here in Los Angeles, and it's great to be home. It's great to be here for a lot of reasons, and in no small part, given the topic today, that California is really the epicenter of this new approach to holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the harms of climate change. You can see from this slide, there are a series of locations across the state, both cities and counties. Actually, this slide is slightly out of date. I made it a week ago, and Richmond, California stepped into the fray. So one has to update this rapidly. As Bill alluded to, New York City, and there are also a couple of international jurisdictions that are moving forward as well. But the real action at the moment is right here in California. And what I want to highlight at the beginning, I'm a scientist, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about how science can inform the case for fossil fuel company accountability. One dimension of that is because increasingly the science that's called climate attribution science is maturing so that we can begin to characterize just how much the harms, the damages, the costs of climate change from particular events can be attributed to human-caused emissions. So here in California, all of you will remember the extensive drought that we had between about 2012 and 2016. Droughts happen, and droughts can be costly. This was a particularly costly drought. Just in the year 2015 alone cost the agricultural industry in this state about $2.7 billion. So droughts do happen, but climate change makes them worse. We're living here in a time of increased temperatures, not globally and also in California, and studies have shown that the rise in temperature in California made the drought worse. Of course, higher temperatures, there's more evaporation, soils dry out, damages become worse, the cost of damage become worse, and the studies have indicated that about a 15 to 20% of the costs and extent and severity of the drought in California over these 4 years was due to the particular impacts of human-caused global warming. I want to show you some other examples as well. New York City, Hurricane Sandy slammed into the coast of east coast of the United States just a little over 5 years ago. Now, when that hurricane hit, it caused tremendous damage, particularly through coastal flooding. We can't say at the moment what the probability of that hurricane, how it was changed by global warming, but we can say that the damages were made substantially worse, and particularly because there have been about 8 inches of sea level rise globally, and including on the Atlantic coast of the US. And so when that storm hit, it caused much more extensive flooding than it would have otherwise had we not had sea level rise, had we not had the rise caused by anthropogenic warming. And so this just gives you an image of a study. The blue areas in this figure of New York City are the areas that would have been flooded under any conditions without any sea level rise. The orange areas are the areas that were flooded only because of the increased sea level rise from global warming, right? The 8 inches of sea level rise. And of course the areas that are blue are much deeper. Can't see it from an aerial photograph, but much deeper and therefore more impactful than they would have been had we not had that additional sea level rise. Now, we don't just have the data on where the impacts were more severe, but we can actually do an economic analysis, as was done in this case, and sea level rise added about $2 billion to the $12 billion of cost to the impacts of coastal flooding from Hurricane Sandy on the city of New York. It's about $230 per individual New Yorker. And New York City has also done really careful studies of what the impacts of climate change will be over the next couple of decades and put economic numbers on those too. The city estimates that about $19.5 billion is what it will take to adapt, to prepare for the impacts that are now locked in by the warming that we've already seen. This is Houston in September, facing the ravages of Hurricane Harvey. Estimated costs of the damages to lives and livelihoods and homes and businesses in Houston and South Texas are on the order of $125 billion. Now, studies have come out just last month that characterized the extent to which the extreme rainfall that hovered over Houston and the surrounding areas that caused such extensive damage was worsened, was made more likely by global warming. Again, on the order of about 15 to 20% more severe as a result of the intensification of precipitation that comes in a warmer world. These studies are beginning to highlight, and there are many others, that we can begin to put boundaries around and characterize the contribution of climate change to particular kinds of extreme events. And it's raising a number of questions. These costs are serious, they're real, they're happening now, and they're going to get larger in the future. And it raises the question, who should pay those costs? And should taxpayers alone, should affected communities alone pay the costs of the damages? That's kind of the default. That's what we do now, right? That's the assumption. But as a billboard that got posted shortly after the hurricane that hit South Texas highlighted, there's another way of asking the question as well, which is relevant to these lawsuits, is when will climate polluters pay their fair share? And by climate polluters, this sign is highlighting the fossil fuel industry, the coal, oil, and natural gas companies who are at the base of the carbon supply chain, who have refined, marketed, and put into action the fossil fuels that we use today. So it raises the question of responsibility. And we can think about that in a legal context, but I think it's important to take a step back and ask about the question of responsibility for climate change in an ethical or more public context. Obviously, we all have responsibilities for the choices we make, about how we use energy, about what cars we drive, the planes we fly on. And governments have responsibilities too. The Framework Convention on Climate Change has as its core principle the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities among nations. There are national responsibilities. Clearly, governments, also at local levels here in California, state levels have responsibilities as well. But the focus underlying these lawsuits is that fossil fuel companies have distinctive responsibilities for the damages of climate change that we're now seeing. And the case for that is fundamentally both as a measure of the size of their contribution and, as Bill McKibben highlighted, the actions they took to sow doubt and disinformation about the risks of their products. I want to just remind you a little bit about what we know about what they knew. So in the early 1980s, for example, the American Petroleum Institute, this is well before the evidence of climate change was made broadly public, they knew full well of the risks of their products, perhaps decades earlier as well, but this is just an example that they created an energy and climate task force to monitor climate change research back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. A series of internal memos highlights that their own company scientists across many companies were reporting on the risks of climate change to company executives. In the late 1990s, well after the evidence became clear and when governments began to act, so this was right as the Kyoto Protocol was being debated, this is an internal memo from the American Petroleum Institute, a communications memo. I don't know if you all can read this. I'll just highlight this for you. This is a communication strategy to sow doubt and disinformation that the American Petroleum Institute used as the basis for a multi-million-dollar disinformation campaign. It says, in part, victory will be achieved when average citizens understand or recognize uncertainties in climate science. Recognition of uncertainties become part of the conventional wisdom. When those promoting the Kyoto Treaty, particularly in the United States, on the basis of extant science, appear to be out of touch with reality. This was a strategy memo that became unearthed. That is just one of many examples of how companies banded together to sow doubt about the risk of their products with the sole intent of avoiding policies that would limit their profitability and use. Of course, the poster child for disinformation campaigns in many respects is ExxonMobil. Exxon took the lead on much of this, and there are many things one could say about this company, but here's just one. This is a series of what are called advertorials, that is paid advertisements, paid editorials that ExxonMobil published over these same years in the late 1990s in the New York Times, all of them highlighting the uncertainties as they sought to promote them in climate science in order to raise doubt about the science, in order to characterize, with climate change, we don't know what can hurt us, unsettled science. You can read these headlines. At the same time, though, the company was using the climate science that they were rejecting publicly in order to inform their own company actions, as a brilliant set of articles published in the Los Angeles Times in collaboration with the Columbia University School of Journalism highlighted just a couple years ago, that while they were engaged in this public disinformation campaign, they were using the same climate models they were disparaging in order to identify, for example, when sea ice would be melting, in order for them to identify and how sea level rise would be increasing, in order to characterize where they could most effectively drill. It's a really powerful misrepresentation of the disinformation campaign that they led. Now, it's important to recognize that companies had alternatives available to them. So in the late 1990s, at the same time, John Browne, later Lord Browne, the chairman of British Petroleum, you may remember, rebranded BP as Beyond Petroleum. And he made a very powerful speech in Stanford University in which he said, we have a responsibility to act, and BP accepts that responsibility. And for a time, began to engage in turning his company into a low-carbon energy, a renewable energy company. But that was very short-lived. And even today, even as companies now pay lip service to the realities of climate risks, note the importance of the Paris Agreement, they continue to invest in a future in which we're heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So just to show you an example, this dotted line shows you the pathway of future emissions we would need to be on if temperatures were to stay below the 2-degree target that was agreed to in Paris in 2015. I'm just going to quickly scroll through a set of examples of pathways that companies use. BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, there are others. And they highlight what they believe the future of our reliance on fossil fuels, on coal, oil, and natural gas will be. And these are the emissions associated with them. They know that their products cause these harms, and that they continue to invest in a world that will bring us to 3 to 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I want to close by highlighting some recent science that I have had the privilege of participating in, that I believe will be helpful to the legal case and the conversations about how we can connect actions of companies to real damages. It's a paper that came out last fall, and it characterizes just how much of the rise in global temperature, carbon dioxide, and sea level can be traced to the emissions from individual fossil energy companies. I want to just take a moment to walk this through. We know from a study of a colleague of mine, Richard Heady, published in 2013. So just this blue graph is the annual emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, the principal greenhouse gases, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, that have been sent to the atmosphere from all combustions of fossil fuels. The red, which Richard Heady characterized, are the contributions of emissions from just 90 companies, the 90 largest fossil fuel companies and a few cement manufacturers. What he showed is that nearly 2/3 of all of the industrial sources of carbon dioxide and methane can be traced back to just 90 companies. More than half of those emissions have been released since 1988, since we really knew publicly of the risks of their products. Now, if you want to connect that to real damages, you have to take a couple of steps. When emissions go to the atmosphere, some of them stays in the atmosphere, some into the oceans, some go into lands. And you need to know in a climate model where those emissions go. You also need to take account of the natural sources of variability in climate, from volcanoes, from other natural effects. And in a study that we published, as I mentioned in the fall, we took Richard Heady's data, incorporated it into a climate model, looked at the differences in how much climate change we'd see with and without the emissions just from these companies. And we compared the results over the whole dawn of the period of the industrial history of fossil fuel production, and then also recently, just since 1980, since companies knew of the risks of their products, very quickly. What do we know? We know that from these 90 carbon producers, 90 largest companies, about half of the rise in global temperature since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution can be traced to the products of just these 90 companies. Since the 1980, since they knew clearly of the risks of their products and could have taken action to address them, about 1/3 of the rise in global temperature can be attributed to the emissions from their products. And we can characterize individual companies. So this is the top 20 companies. I won't go into the details of this, but this just shows you that we can put a number on the contribution of emissions traced to Exxon, to Chevron, to BP, to other companies, to the rise in global surface temperature. We can trace the contribution of emissions from these companies to the rise in global sea level. These numbers may seem small, so 2 to 3% of the rise in global sea level can be traced, for example, to the products of Chevron and ExxonMobil. The numbers may seem small, but remember, the costs are very large. The damages are very large, in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. And the question before us, both in the court of public opinion and now, I think in a very important way, in the court of law, is to what extent should these companies be held liable for these damages that we can now characterize, we can monetize, and we can specify in really important ways. And I believe that the synergy between science and law and public opinion is really at a moment in which we can begin to address this, not only here in California, but across the nation and the world. So thank you very much.
Whoops, I don't know where. Let's see if I can get her. Somebody help me out with the PowerPoint to get to the next one. How do I get to the next one? This is
Yeah, so you just want to do this.
there we go.
Let's do that.
Thank you, and I hope that Peter has persuaded you that fossil fuel companies, perhaps, at least from a moral perspective, ought to be paying for the damages that they've caused knowingly. What I'm going to try to do is to take the science and tell you whether that's likely to be the case in a court of law. I do want to remind everyone that in some respects, everything old is new again. So we've had a president who's pulled us out of an international climate accord, who's refused to take action at the federal level to try to reduce U.S. emissions, and who, during his term, faced a number of these nuisance lawsuits. That was when George W. Bush was president. And at the time of those nuisance lawsuits, I was skeptical that they would succeed. And my skepticism, I think, proved to be well-founded. Virtually, or literally, all of those cases were dismissed, often dismissed really early in procedural stages, just on the grounds that courts felt uncomfortable trying to adjudicate questions that are as large as this question. And so I think the open question now is, should we remove some of that skepticism? And I should disclose that I am assisting the plaintiffs' lawyers in some of these cases because I think there's a real shot here. And I think there's a real shot for a number of reasons, some of which Peter has already specified, but which I want to now link to what the legal standards are that these plaintiffs are going to face, particularly in California courts, which is, again, as Peter suggested, where I think the action is going to be for, in the immediate term. So let me start with the first reason. So Peter's already told you that the science connecting emissions to harm is significantly stronger now than it was during the George W. Bush administration. And it's possible now to show real connections between anthropogenic emissions and things like sea level rise, the magnitude of drought, extreme heat, and so forth. And that makes a legal difference, as I'll explain in a moment. It's also the case that the defendants that the plaintiffs have chosen to sue are different in an important way from the defendants that were sued during the Bush administration. The plaintiffs in those early suits concentrated on fossil fuel emitters, that is, power plants, auto manufacturers, and so forth. And the plaintiffs this time have made a strategic decision, which I think is an important one from a legal perspective, to focus instead on the extractor defendants, who do emit some of their own emissions through the production process, but by and large are responsible for the product that then gets utilized by power plants, all of us who drive, and so forth. And it's an interesting legal question about whether that makes a difference, but I think the big reason it makes a positive difference in this case is because the percentage of contribution to the problem, as Peter has so artfully spelled out, makes a big difference from a legal perspective, and again, I'll explain why. The third reason why I think these cases are much stronger is the evidence that Peter discussed about the knowledge that Exxon, the American Petroleum Institute, Shell, and others had that climate change was real, that it was occurring. They knew this as long as 50 years ago, and then engaged in an extensive campaign of disinformation. That matters from a legal perspective. It's not just a nice fact to throw in. And finally, and this is parallel, I think, to what happened in the tobacco litigation, which I think a lot of people are looking to as a parallel. We have really sophisticated lawyers involved, and that may seem like just a shout out to the legal profession, but it matters. And here's how it matters. The lawyers who have brought the vast majority of the cases in California are very sophisticated environmental tort lawyers. They have sued big, deep-pocketed defendants in the past, and they know how to do it, and they have a lot of resources behind them. And so, the Village of Kivalina case, which was a very compelling case, didn't have the kinds of resources behind it that the cases that are being brought today do, along with the resources of municipalities, some of which are quite large, and the sophistication of city attorneys. So for those four reasons, I have some real optimism that these cases have a shot. not going to predict that they're going to prevail, but I think they have a real shot in a way that I never thought was true during the Bush administration. So I want to say more about each of these and tie them a little bit to the legal standards. So let's first talk about the responsible emitters. I have a slightly different cut on the information that Peter provided about that. He talked about the 90 companies that are responsible for a very large percentage of global emissions over the course of the last 30, 50 years. The defendants that are named in the litigation here, most of them are, there's some complexities about a couple of them dropping out for various reasons, that is the US tied emitters, we have to have them tied to the United States for jurisdictional purposes, are responsible for 25% of global CO2 emissions from 1965 to the present, so in the last 50 years. Why does this matter legally? Well, it matters legally. Let me say just a little bit about what the claim is that the plaintiffs are making. So the cause of action includes both public and private nuisance, and they're being brought on the part of the people of the state of California, but also on behalf of individual counties and cities. What do you need to show to demonstrate that something is a public nuisance? I'll concentrate on that since that's gotten the most attention. They need to demonstrate that a defendant knowingly created, and we'll talk about knowing in a minute, or assisted in the creation of a substantial and unreasonable interference with a public right. So you can think of the word creation for the lawyers in the room as somewhat equivalent to causation. So cities and counties need to show that the defendants created or assisted in creating a substantial interference with the public right. So substantial interference is going to be related to what percentage these defendants actually are contributing to climate change. And one of the problems with the early cases is that the defendants who were chosen, the power plants, the auto manufacturers, and so forth, were responsible for a significantly smaller percentage of total emissions. And that mattered when the courts actually decided these cases on actually a number of different grounds, including standing, where the court said, we can't really determine that these defendants were responsible for the harm that the plaintiffs are complaining about. That's a lot harder case to make against the plaintiffs, in other words, to drop the cases on the grounds that the defendants weren't responsible, given this extraordinary evidence about just how responsible they actually are. Okay, attribution science. So this is, as Peter talked about, how much can we tell whether a particular event or trends like sea level rise are attributable to anthropogenic greenhouse gases as opposed to natural variation in the climate. And that evidence has gotten a lot stronger. This chart shows the red line is the responsibility of emitters to sea level rise. The top bar, it says black, but it's actually blue, is the actual sea level rise that's occurring, and you can see just how much of that is created and caused by anthropogenic emissions. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because we can take the harm and connect it, again, to the emissions that are emitted by these defendants who have been responsible for a very significant percentage of greenhouse gases. That's a huge deal from a liability perspective. It matters a lot in whether the plaintiffs are actually going to be able to prevail. Again, in several earlier cases, Kivalina is one. There was a case involving damages, a case trying to seek compensation for damages caused by Hurricane Katrina, where the courts just said, we don't know whether they caused harm. We don't even know whether the harm is caused by climate change, and we're going to dismiss these cases. I think these cases today are at much less risk of being dismissed on those grounds. And then we've got knowledge questions. And so I'm just going to, this is not a repeat of what Peter put up, but it's more evidence of the way in which oil companies, Exxon being probably the most egregious, but decent evidence about others, and we're likely to find more evidence from other defendants as discovery proceeds, that these companies knew what was going on. They knew that what they were burning in the atmosphere, the product they were selling to be combusted, was going to cause climate change. And they knew it early. This is a 1968 report. There are quotes from it. I'm not going to read them. You can read them up there. That was prepared for the American Petroleum Institute that demonstrates pretty clearly that greenhouse gases are going to cause climate change. Not only that, they knew that the window of opportunity for action was closing. This is the Bill McKibben point, right? That we can't wait 40 years to actually address these problems, but instead we've got to act now. And we're hearing this in 1978 and 1982, that oil companies know this. They know that action is important and it's got to happen quickly. And yet, they then engage in, as Peter has already demonstrated to you, a multi-million-dollar effort to try to get the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol, to cast doubt on the climate science, et cetera. And so, again, the question is, so does this matter legally? We didn't have this kind of evidence available to us in the first round of the nuisance litigation during the Bush administration. We had probably some idea that the defendants knew something about anthropogenic climate change, but now, because of this great reporting by the LA Times and the Columbia School of Journalism, we have far stronger evidence about knowledge. And from a legal perspective, let me tell you why that matters. So if you go back to the public nuisance doctrine that I read to you, one of the things that's important is that the defendants know that they're causing the harm. So just to give you some phrases from California nuisance cases to, again, make clear how important it is that you have knowledge, we're more likely to find a nuisance in cases where the defendant has concealed the dangers of the harm, where a defendant has mounted a campaign against regulation, where a defendant has promoted a product for use even though they have known that such a use was hazardous to human beings, where they have engaged in a massive campaign to promote the use of their product despite knowing of the harms, and so forth. So all of these together, the attribution science, the large percentage of contributions by the defendants to the problem, and the fact that the defendants knew exactly what they were doing, engaged in a campaign to try to undermine the science, even as we know they are preparing themselves to adjust to the likely effects of climate change by doing things like raising their drilling platforms. Those things together give me confidence, although I'm not going to predict with any kind of certainty, that the courts are going to take these cases very, very seriously. The first round of cases were dismissed at very preliminary stages. I don't think that's going to happen here. There are going to be some big jurisdictional fights. Defendants are going to throw all the mud they can at the plaintiffs. But I think they're going to I think the plaintiffs are going to stay in the litigation. We're going to have a big fight about them. We're going to have a lot of discovery. And I think it's maybe more likely than not that at least one court is going to find these defendants liable. So thank you very much, and look forward to the panel conversation.
All right, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Peter. We're going to transition into the panel portion of the evening. I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute. If I can have my panelists come join me up on stage. So Peter, Alex, Gladys. Thank you. Thanks. It doesn't matter. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there should be 6. Great. No order, or any order.
This order.
Does anybody want a water?
Got one.
I have a bottle, thank you.
Yours may still be over there.
Okay.
Yeah?
I have a bottle actually, thanks.
Okay. Thanks. So as I said, I'm Kara Horowitz of the Emmett Institute, and I'm really thrilled to have up here with me today a panel of some terrific folks to talk about these lawsuits from various perspectives. You already know Peter and Anne to my far right. Let me introduce the rest of the folks up here. So Alex Hall, sitting in the snazzy red sweater and bow tie in the middle.
I love compliments, thanks.
Is a professor in the UCLA Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. His research focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change at both a global and a regional scale. Alex directs the Center for Climate Science at UCLA, which is one of our co-sponsors for this event, so thank you, Alex. To Alex's left is Gladys Limon. She's the executive director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. which is the state's leading coalition on environmental justice issues. She's a graduate of Stanford Law School, and she was formerly an attorney with Communities for a Better Environment. And then to my right is Ser Cedillo. Mayor, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
Mayor Ser Cedillo of the city of Imperial Beach. He's also the executive director of the nonprofit Wild Coast. I know that Serge, Mayor Cedillo, tried mightily to take a low-carbon form of transit here. He got on a train this morning. The train broke down. He had a wild adventure making his way up to Westwood. So thank you for your perseverance. We appreciate it. So my plan is to lead a discussion among the panelists until about 7:45 or so, and then open it up to audience questions. I want to start with the first question for Alex. So Alex, as we've heard, many of the lawsuits that we're talking about this evening have been brought by California cities and counties, California communities. You arguably know as much as anybody on earth about what the impacts will be to California communities, to the region, and even to some localities. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about what the harms from climate change are in California communities already, what they're likely to be going forward. And in particular, it's not just sea level rise, right? So talk to us about what these communities are feeling and what they will be feeling.
Well, I think we might hear from some of the other panelists about sea level rise. So I might just briefly say that, obviously California's coastal infrastructure is vulnerable generally to sea level rise. The ports in Los Angeles are vulnerable, and San Francisco has a lot of vulnerability also in the Bay Area because a lot of the area near the bay is very low. But beyond sea level rise, we've seen a significant increase in heat extremes in California cities that is related to a changing climate. That has public health consequences because heat extremes are associated with mortality and morbidity. It's a big challenge to the electrical grid, and power outages are also have harmful consequences. And so that's one component, I think, of harm. I was intrigued also by the numbers that Peter talked about, the 20% attribution in New York City of the damage from sandy to climate change, and that fraction sort of was kept on appearing. We've done studies looking at the impact of climate change to date on the Sierra snowpack, and we found that about 20% of the snowpack now is missing every year due to climate change. So both during drought years and in extremely wet years. And the snowpack, as many of you know, is a very important component of California's natural water infrastructure. It has important flood control purposes. And if we lose the snowpack, we will have significant challenges to the management of California's water infrastructure. You showed an image of Lake Oroville. The damage to Lake Oroville spillway a year or two ago is an example, I think, an early example of how when we have early precipitation that comes as rainfall in California, that poses a significant challenge to California's water infrastructure, and there are economic damages associated with that. So that's another example. Assemblymember Garcia mentioned air quality, and a lot of the chemical reactions that cause air quality to decline are temperature sensitive, and so as you warm the climate, you expect deterioration in air quality, and that's something that will differentially impact disadvantaged communities. There's a direct EJ component there. And then the last thing that I might mention is the impact of climate change on wildfire.
If you didn't mention it, I was going to ask you, because you can't have lived in the city for the last month and not be wondering.
So if you talk to a lot of fire ecologists, one thing that they've been saying is that all the models they use to predict fire are failing, that we seem to be entering a new regime of fire ecology in California. So in the recent Santa Ana event that was responsible for the Thomas Fire, we had some unusual characteristics, unusually warm temperatures and unusually dry winds. Santa Ana winds are always dry, but these were particularly dry. And those are characteristics of the Santa Anas that we project will become more common in the future. So I suspect if we were to do an attribution study of that event, we would find that some component of it could be attributed to climate change. So that's a kind of a sampling, I think, of what we are already seeing. It's too bad that we can't do this attribution science more quickly because we just kind of can't keep up with all these things that keep happening, and we need to know more.
So I'm glad I have one quick follow-up before I move on. I'm glad you talked about the attribution studies that you do. Are some of those types of climate harms easier to attribute to climate change than others, or some of those types of harms easier to attribute to climate change?
Yeah, so I think that Peter may disagree, but I think the scientific case for attribution is different and is stronger in some cases. So the effects that can be attributed directly to warming, so sea level rise, snowpack changes. Everyone knows snow melts 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and if you warm the climate, you're going to get less snow. Those are very direct impacts of the increased heat in the atmosphere. The wildfire is an example of a very complicated situation where you have the condition of the vegetation is important for fire characteristics. You also have the fact that somebody has to start that fire. And then there's also there are questions about attributing changes in the atmospheric circulation to climate change. That's a kind of thorny problem. And all those things have to be examined and parsed out. And I don't know whether it's possible to kind of quantify the relative roles in something as complex as a fire. So I think there are differences, and they're probably important for the legal implications as well.
Thanks. So Mayor Cedillo, my next question's for you.
Okay.
So your city, Imperial Beach, is a plaintiff in one of these lawsuits. In fact, your city was, I think, among the very first to sue.
The first, number one.
The very first. Thanks for the clarification. So can you talk about what challenges you're currently facing as a city manager that led you to try and, that motivated you to sue in the first place? And we all know that taking on fossil fuel companies isn't risk-free. I think they're actually already seeking to depose you personally, if I have that correct.
It's a funny story.
So talk about what you're hoping to get out of it. Why is it worth it to you?
Sure, yeah. First, thanks to everybody at UCLA and the Unit of Concerned Scientists for the invite. A shout out to Cassie Siegel, a good friend of mine and colleague, climate warrior in California. Cassie, raise your hand at the Center for Biological Diversity. Very shy. We were in southern Mexico together not too long ago in the fall, seeing some amazing stuff. And I do conservation work in Mexico and Cuba and the United States. That's my full-time job. So very cognizant of the need to preserve natural ecosystems. So Cassie was down with me and a group of people to see what's at stake. And when we talk about rising temperatures and climate change, my son Daniel and his buddy, Daniel's an engineering student at UCLA, and his buddy Ryan, we were just in Mexico together.
Hi, Mayor's son.
UCLA must be doing a good job because we were in Mexico on a surf trip together recently, and these kids were talking about the ethics and morality of, I'm not even sure, but I think it was climate change. But anyway, good. So, all right, so Imperial Beach, working class, mostly minority city on the US-Mexico border, surrounded by water, okay? 30% of our kids live in poverty, and I'm not proud of that. 25% of our residents live in poverty. I wasn't elected to be an environmentalist because I am one. I was elected to help the lowest income folks in our city who have been ignored for 60 years by our city fathers and the slumlords and absentee landlords who have kept them in poverty to pave alleys and put in crosswalks and get a grocery store. And so all of a sudden, we started embarking on this sea level rise adaptation planning process. And let me make it clear, the jurisdictions in California that have signed on to this lawsuit take this ethic of responsibility very seriously. We understand the implications and the professional sort of procedures you need to carry forward to understand the impacts to your city. So we've embarked on sea level rise adaptation studies. We know what the impact will be. And in addition, with Marin and San Mateo counties and Santa Cruz, really proud, and with Richmond, we know how much it will cost us. We've done the homework. So got elected mayor, we embarked on this process. You saw the picture of our lifeguards on the street. During El Nino, some of you might have known that 12 inches of sea level rise, right above normal. So we saw this crazy flooding happen with just a little bit of big surf. If you're a surfer, you're always looking for surf a little bit above the average like we had in the last few weeks. And so it was like, wow, we were doing these studies, and then we saw the future coming at us, like flooding on South San Diego Bay that we'd never seen before, a Bayshore Bikeway flooding, highest tides in ever, right, recorded. Surf happening, big surf, our chronic flooding, the south end of our Seacoast Drive, always underwater now in the winter. So we saw that coming at us. We're on the US-Mexico border. In addition to filing a lawsuit, since we're the most badass small beach city in Southern California, we've taken on 35 of the world's largest fossil fuel companies. We've also taken on the United States government and Veolia Water, the world's largest water company, for causing irreparable harm to our ocean environment because of the dumping of toxic waste. And I'm talking about toxic waste and toxic sewage into the Tijuana River and our ocean. So, if you're a badass, blue-collar, tough town, I'm sorry, what's the risk? Because we're already dealing, and that's something that's really important, and I think that's something that's really important when I called my son about the fires that happened just above UCLA, and I was in Montecito this weekend. They're already here. The risk is not doing anything, and I find it embarrassing that IB, Imperial Beach, was the first city, and that the wealthiest, most privileged communities in the world have decided that it's somebody else's problem. I was in Montecito and Santa Barbara this weekend talking to the Bar Association. They get it. Climate change is here, it's happening. Climate instability has meant that we can't afford to wait. My parents are war refugees, immigrants. My dad sued the French government for stealing from his family, and he won, and he tried to sue the French railway for sending his family to concentration camps and killing them, and then charging the Nazis to do it. They made money on it. They didn't win. So if you'd raised in a family like that, and you spent the last 20 years battling Mitsubishi, Chevron, the Mexican government, the Chinese government, for trying to destroy the world's most beautiful places, yeah, what's 35 fossil fuel companies? And then I'm going to show you just what they did on the phone. So, Daniel. All right. So it started, right? The lawyers, the expensive lawyers that get paid $1,000 an hour that don't live in no-profit families like the one I grew up in and live in. They're now doing the discovery, right? They can look at my personal cell phone. So they wanted the keyword Santa Cruz. So Santa Cruz, right, if you're a surfer and with 2 sons at UCLA and then at San Luis Obispo and you spend all your vacations surfing them down the coast, sure, it's a constant flood of emails with video and photos of surfing in Santa Cruz, talking about going to Santa Cruz. So thank God those really, really boring lawyers that have no ethics and no concern for humanity, at least they'll have some interesting things when they look at the video and photos of my kids surfing in Santa Cruz. So anyway, there you go. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Not sure what else to say to that. Gladys. So, as we heard from the Assemblywoman, and as of course many of us know, the impacts of climate change in California often fall on communities that are least able to deal with those impacts. You have been at the heart of advocacy against the fossil fuel industry in Southern California for a long time, opposing oil drilling in Los Angeles, and a proposed new fossil fuel plant in Oxnard, among other things. And I'm curious if you see interactions between this set of lawsuits we've been talking about this evening and efforts by the environmental justice community to ensure that the costs of climate change harms are borne fairly and equitably. I'm curious if you can relate, your work to this conversation we've been having about who should really pay for climate change harms.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having us here today. So the California Environmental Justice Alliance is a community-based alliance composed of the 10 leading environmental justice organizations in California, working to bring environmental justice to disproportionately impacted communities. Many of those communities and others throughout the state are at the front lines of fossil fuel infrastructure, so are in really close proximity and disproportionately impacted by refineries, oil drilling, gas plants. And so in addition to suffering the daily impacts from the air pollution and safety risks, we know that these types of communities, both locally and internationally, communities of color, low-income communities, are at the most risk of climate change and are already experiencing the worst impacts, or the first and worst to get hit, and have the least resources to adapt. And these communities have been fighting for accountability from oil companies for decades, at their own peril, with very little resources, not with the deep pockets of some of the law firms that were mentioned earlier, or governments. Here in Los Angeles, when I was at CBE together with CBD and some very courageous and brilliant small law firm attorneys brought a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles to challenge longstanding practices that allow for expansion of drill sites next to homes and schools, right? So families growing right next to drilling operations. And those kids in CBD are now being sued by the oil lobby group in California, which also includes Exxon. They also have been fighting against extractive practices and other destructive practices such as deforestation because they experience the impacts firsthand. And so they've been leading the fight. These communities have been leading the fight for their own families as well as for all of us globally. Now, we're relieved to see these sorts of lawsuits by government and having them take the bold and necessary actions that are commensurate with the crisis that we have at hand, when in the past they largely have failed to do so. And we need the sort of leadership that demands accountability from the oil companies. We also need governments to take responsibility for their own actions, such as divestment, but also to really seize permitting and expansion of existing oil operations and fossil fuel infrastructure. So I want to talk a little bit about just the disproportionate impacts of the fossil fuel infrastructure to communities of color and low-income communities, and also the climate change impacts on these communities. So refineries, oil drilling operations, and gas operations, again, are disproportionately cited in low-income communities, communities of color. And along with greenhouse gases that they emit, there are co-pollutants that they emit on a daily basis that worsen the air quality in these communities. So again, they have been exposed to premature death, respiratory diseases, and a host of other health and safety problems. Starting with refineries, which are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in California, those are primarily located in communities of color, in the community of Wilmington here in LA, and in Richmond. And in California, we're seeing that refineries are actually expanding, and they're also processing dirtier crude, which increase emissions. Also, with oil drilling operations, just in the county of Los Angeles, there are over 5,000 active oil wells. Over 70% of those are within 1,500 feet of homes and schools. And communities of color are subjected to closer proximity to these operations. So imagine you're raising your children right next to oil drilling or refinery. That is the reality of thousands of children and families in California. We have fracking in California, the majority of which happens in Kern County, which has a very high poverty level. Over half of the population are Latino. And it overwhelmingly occurs in homes, next to homes and schools of Latino families. So children are exposed to the chemicals and toxic co-pollutants of these operations. Even the transportation of crude. So increasingly the crude that is being transported is highly volatile. In our communities are known as bomb trains. And a recent study showed that about 80% of the people who are within a 1 mile radius of what would be the evacuation zone of the tracks are communities of color and low income. So again, our communities are hit by the impacts on a daily basis, and they've been advocating in different venues to mitigate and also just altogether seize these impacts. But they're also disproportionately impacted by climate change itself. So we've already seen a number of examples based on recent catastrophes, including the government's failure to respond adequately to the catastrophes in Puerto Rico. With Hurricane Harvey in Texas, we saw low-income communities and Latino and African-American communities that are in close proximity to hundreds of petrochemical plants that were subjected not just to the floods, but also then to chemicals and through a number of emergency shutdown operations and other operations of the refineries. Environmental refugees are primarily people of color. even with the fires that have devastated numerous communities throughout the state of California, with deaths and, and other sort of devastating impacts, we haven't heard as much about the farm working communities and undocumented people who are equally as impacted but don't have the resources or the aid. And of course, in terms of responding to or adapting to and being resilient to the impacts of climate change, low-income communities don't have the same safety nets, from health insurance to home insurance to the ability to temporarily move away for safety, by hotels or renting, homes. So we're already seeing that the disproportionate impacts are borne by communities of color and working class communities. And governments, first and foremost, their mandate is to protect the health and safety of people. That's what we pay taxes for. That is at the core of their function. So they need to increasingly act to hold these companies accountable. Again, they need to stop the permitting of these facilities, and they also need to rapidly transition us into a clean energy economy, create the infrastructure, and ensure that there are good, clean, green jobs, and that those jobs are union and are accessible to the workers that are being displaced. And obviously creating the infrastructure and responding to climate change catastrophes is very costly. So they absolutely have that duty and that mandate to act and bear those costs. But the public and those communities that have been most impacted have been essentially subsidizing the oil companies' dirty business. They haven't paid the true costs of their business, and it's time, it's long overdue that they do so.
Thanks. So, Peter, question for you. So you've spent a number of years and done an awfully lot of good work we heard about in your presentation, working to bolster the idea that it's appropriate morally, scientifically, legally to assign blame for climate change. What do you say to the counter-argument that we're not going to solve climate change by pointing fingers and arguing about who's to blame? Instead, we should be using our energies to focus on solutions. This is an argument I've read in the last few days on Twitter a bunch, for example.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kara. The word blame isn't one that I use. I think responsibility is a much better term. And with the problem like climate change, if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways to think about this vexing global challenge. And yes, there are things that individuals can and should do, as I mentioned in my talk, that governments can and should do. But as individuals, particularly low-income individuals who don't have access to other information or financial resources to go out and buy a more expensive, lower-emitting car, or to those aren't choices that people have available. The choices are limited and locked in about what people don't want to use fossil energy; they want to use energy. And the question of what energy choices we have has been quite closed, quite limited, in no small part by decisions that these companies made 40 years ago and have made ever since, well knowing the risks of their products. It's not backwards looking to identify their distinctive responsibilities that I think are legitimate, both informed by ethics and science, if in fact by highlighting the fact that they could have made different choices, we would be having very different options available to us today, and we need to have different options available to us today and tomorrow. And if these companies are, as they have been historically, standing in the way of sensible climate policies in order to wean ourselves from the reliance on fossil fuels, in order to promote clean energy, then they need to be held accountable for those actions. And in doing so, open up the opportunities for individuals of all demographic backgrounds to be able to have access to affordable clean energy and not be reliant on the fossil fuels that these companies have worked for decades to ensure our continued reliance on. So I don't think it's backward-looking blame. I think it's forward-looking responsibility. And in the absence of other powerful policy and, as Assemblywoman Garcia highlighted, measures to move forward focusing on company responsibility is legitimate. It may also be essential.
Sure, Alex.
Can I chain on? Can I ask that in a legal kind of way? Maybe this is a question for Anne, I think. So,
Anne gets the next question, so take it away.
okay, so I'm thinking back to the tobacco case where the tobacco companies create this product. They know it's bad. They sell it to people, and the people consume it, and there's harm directly to the consumer. In this case, the fossil fuel companies are producing this product. They know it's bad for the environment. They provide it to a consumer, and then the consumer emits it into the environment, not knowing, I guess, that it's harmful. I guess. Are they blameless, or do they matter? Does that change the legal dynamics at all?
Yeah. So this is going to be one of the defenses from the oil companies. There's no question. It's not just the kind of individual consumer who drives the car, turns the lights on. We've also got intermediaries. We have power companies, and we have auto manufacturers, and so forth. And so there's going to be a lot of attempt to say, we're not responsible. The responsible parties are the ones who actually burn the fuel that emits the emissions. So I guess I think the closest parallel in the tobacco litigation is that the line of defense the tobacco industry used was, we're not smoking the cigarettes. Individuals are the ones who are putting them into their mouths and buying cigarettes, even when they know of the harm, which is actually not the case here, right? There are a lot of people for a long time who were using fossil fuels who didn't understand the connection to climate change. And the sort of the legal turn that worked in the tobacco case was to say, you created an addiction problem. And so you caused people to use the product that you knew was harmful. And here I think there's a parallel. I think you have a series of companies who know that the product that they're producing creates harms. They are advertising to get people to use that product. They are affirmatively blocking policies that might lead to cleaner sources of energy so that people can buy electric cars or what have you. In a very active campaign, this is why I think the knowledge question is so important legally, because I think that evidence that not only did they know it was happening, but they actively tried to prevent the government from adopting policies that would have forced them to internalize the harms they were causing, is going to make it a lot weaker argument to say, our hands are clean, this is not our problem, this is the problem of the individual consumer who actually emits the emission. But we're going to see a fight on it. There's no question that that is going to be one of the big legal defenses.
I'd love to open it up to some audience questions. Eric and Stephanie, are you armed and ready with your microphones? So because we are being live webcast, you're going to have to ask your question into a microphone. So Stephanie, pick one of these lovely people with their hands up, please. Thanks so much.
Why, hello, thank you. I'm with Alex Hall, and that this all reminds me of the tobacco litigation. What I didn't hear from Ann Carlson just now is whatever happened with the tobacco litigation in terms of legal theory, success, and remedies, especially in terms of, who got what and how much of the problem was solved. So maybe somebody could speak to that and let us know what the lessons are from that could be applied to the sorts of lawsuits you're talking about here.
Sure. So I think there are a few lessons. I think one lesson is that there were numerous lawsuits filed, many of which failed early on. I mean, if you remember back to those days, the standard defense was they picked up the cigarettes and smoked and they didn't need to. And juries and judges dismissed the cases and found in favor. And then we started to see more and more of this knowledge information that, again, kind of parallels the information we now know about Exxon and others. And we also started to see, I think, a marshaling of lawyer talent, this is why I think that who the lawyers are and whether they have resources matters so much. So the attorneys general, remember, partnered with plaintiffs, tort lawyers who actually made money on this. They were, they got part of the recoveries. And a lot of the recoveries went to states for medical expenses, for increased medical expenses from diseases that were caused by smoking, although you may also remember that the tobacco companies argued that they were actually saving the government money by killing people earlier. Seriously, that was one of the defenses of the tobacco industry. We're going to see a lot of that, but I think the parallel would be here, putting money into the coffers of states and localities to respond to the damages that have been caused on, you know, and you're going to have to proportion. It's going to be complicated, as it was with cigarette companies. Like, who was smoking 40 years ago? What brand were they smoking? All kinds of complex legal questions that needed to be sorted out. But this is not unprecedented, and I think we're going to see. We're certainly, the plaintiff's bar is going to try very hard to make this look a lot more like the success down the road of the tobacco litigation as opposed to the early cases.
Was anybody made whole? Did anybody get?
So there were individual plaintiffs who won damages. I mean, what's whole when you lose your life? But, you know, we do value life in dollar terms. And so there were individual plaintiffs who won, and then there were states who, you know, sued on behalf of the people using public nuisance-like arguments in order to get the state repaid for the medical expenses that they were being burdened with as a result of the health problems that smokers were experiencing.
Thanks. Another question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, I'm Dr. Kamansky. Yesterday I received a Department of Energy bulletin from Secretary of the Department of Energy, Perry, and I wanted you to read it. Number 2 is that they're telling me that I should believe in coal because they're going to extract rare earth metals from it. Now, how do I know when I'm using a rare earth metal that it didn't come from coal? That is they're going to lose their defense here. Read it. It gives $18.5 million to solar research. They're going to fund the nuclear industry. There's 8. And I'm fairly upset about it because how do I know that I'm not using rare earth metals that are being extracted from coal? And I think they're using that as an excuse to finance the coal industry and make them more profitable. But just something, you should read it. I think it's critical. I think you could use it as a defense. I think they've turned a corner here or shot themselves in the foot, so to speak.
So
Thank
just
you.
because I know we're short on time, is there another? Oh, okay. I will take a look at it. Thank you. Eric, you want to? Maybe one more. Yeah.
Hi. It's more maybe part rhetorical. So in California, we have CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which is highly touted. Everyone loves it. And it's like the gold standard. If it's so great, then why do we have to really sue? It's rhetorical because it's only enforceable if you sue. What are we doing to be proactive now and have, you know, all these communities that don't have the resources, how do they also get involved and be proactive when we are relying on CEQA to save us, you know, this whole time?
The mayor wants this one.
Yeah, I don't need the microphone. So yeah, let me make it clear. And I think this is a big issue with social equity and who's going to pay. And I think, you know, you addressed. Malibu can self-fund a geologic hazard district to pay for sand replenishment. You know, Montecito, devastating. Bel Air, devastating. Those folks have some resources to address the issues themselves. But the CEQA is not going to save us. For coastal communities, what we have is the California Coastal Act. I want to shout out to Governor Browne and John Leiter, Secretary of Resources, and then the California Coastal Commission, the Coastal Conservancy, because they've been funding us and other communities to go out and do the adaptation planning, this foundation funding that we got to do the economic impact studies. So we're all doing these studies, and California communities now, coastal communities, are going to be required to address sea level rise. And actually, you just had a 200-unit. We are building housing, by the way. We're not a mausoleum for the wealthy in our beach town. We just built 200 units of middle-class housing on the bay, and above the 100-year sea level rise zone. And so that's what we're starting to do. That's what's starting to happen. But one of the reasons I'm here is because this is the essential issue for California. The rich are going to be able to pay on their own, but the majority of Californians in our state is becoming an apartheid state because of inequality. It's a fact of life, and it's a problem the governor didn't address today in the State of the Union. His state address. We've got to figure this out, and that's why we're suing. This is not a publicity stunt. It's not because I'm pissed off because my dad, you know, sued the French government or whatever. I'm an environmentalist. It's because the very real practical issue. My city does not have the hundreds of millions of dollars it needs to pay for this, and neither do the majority of low-income and middle-class communities in California. And these companies cause the harm, and they need to pay for the damage because the state government and the federal government, for sure, is not coming to the rescue. There is no one coming to help. CEQA is not going to help us, but these companies, as these scientists have so eloquently pointed out, with hard, compelling data and science-based data, cause the problem. They have the resources to pay for it, and they should pay. Write a check, pay.
I think that's a good place to leave the panel. Why don't you join me in thanking our panelists? And I'm going to call up to the stage the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, Ken Kimmel, who's just going to make some closing remarks. Thanks so much, Ken.
Well, what an evening this has been. I want to thank the Emmett Center and the Center for Climate Science and the Institute for hosting all of us. As an alumni of the UCLA Law School, I could not be more proud to be part of this community. And I also want to thank Dan Emmett, if he's still here. I hope you're proud of the wonderful conversation that you helped sponsor tonight with your generosity. Now, late in the evening, after much has been said, one comes into a conflict between the good and the new, which is anything good that you might say at this hour is probably not likely to be very new, and anything new that you could say is probably not likely to be good. But I'm going to give it a shot anyway. I'm going to make a couple of observations, and then I will leave you on your way after we do a little bit of a game of imagination. The first observation I'd like to make comes from that great student of American democracy, Alex de Tocqueville, who said in 1830, and I'm quoting, "There is hardly any political question in the United States which does not sooner or later turn into a judicial one." What a remarkably prescient and enduring remark that was in 1830. And all in our history, we've seen so many examples when our political system has been stuck and justice is not available for large numbers of people. It takes brave lawyers and judges with backbones to turn that around. So we saw it. Think about the Jim Crow laws and school desegregation. Think about one person, one vote, marriage equality, the right to privacy, and very recently, the courts now starting to take aim at political and racial gerrymandering. So I bring that up because we're going to hear from the defendants in this lawsuit how unprecedented this is, how wrong it is to try to use the courts as instruments of justice and social change. And what I want to say is this is as American as apple pie. This is part of our system. We've been doing it for a very, very long time, and it is a unique, distinguishing feature of our democracy. So it is no surprise that as Trump has gone AWOL on climate change is now getting into the courtroom. And I have to say this couldn't happen soon enough because those oil and gas companies know they have a lock on this administration. They know they have a lock on Congress. They are not feeling pressure to change their behavior. And so pressure has to come from other sources. And I do believe that these lawsuits already are and will continue to create pressure, either because these companies fear at the end of the day large liability, or because along the way when these lawsuits get reported and information gets unearthed, it will inevitably affect public opinion and inevitably chip away at the social licenses that these companies possess. So these are very, very important lawsuits. We're just at the beginning of them. We don't know really where they're going to end up. But I'm going to leave you all, I'm going to ask you all to imagine what success might look like. You can close your eyes if you want as you do this imagining, but please don't fall asleep just yet. So imagine that inspired by the example of these California cities, including this incredible brave mayor who started the whole thing, cities and communities all over the country, not just in blue states, but in red states, realize that they too are suffering climate-related damages And they join these states in bringing lawsuits. So it's not just a handful, but a much larger and more geographically and politically representative group. Imagine that these lawsuits survive that avalanche of motions to dismiss, and it's clear now that these suits are going to stay here, and it's clear that the fossil fuel industry is going to be exposed to discovery. Imagine that through this discovery, many new documents are unearthed which shed new light on what these companies knew and how they acted in response to that knowledge. Documents that would make that API statement really be seen as the tip of the iceberg. Imagine that in response to that, we see many more whistleblowers from these companies come forward with information that they have about what happened along the way. And imagine that because of all of that, public opinion starts cementing on the idea that these companies knew about these harms, deceived the public about these harms, blocked the political system from acting upon them, and the public starts to understand that yes, we are all responsible for climate change, but some have as Peter said, a distinctive responsibility. And then imagine that some of these companies don't like the way this is going, and they voluntarily adopt measures to try to align their business models with the Paris Agreement. They start divesting, for example, from very high carbon intensive reserves. And imagine that they all stop funding any more climate deception or any more political action to stop climate change. And as that momentum gathers, and as other sources of pressure are brought to bear that Bill McKibben told us about, because certainly the courtroom is not the only place where this is going to happen, imagine a comprehensive settlement of all of these claims that involves a national limit on carbon emissions or carbon pricing to achieve the same result, the end of subsidies for fossil fuel industries, a fund that's created from fossil fuel profits to pay for climate resilience and adaptation, particularly for the types of vulnerable communities that we heard about tonight. Imagine that a special master is appointed from the courts to oversee the plans by which these companies will adapt and change their business plans to align with our goals. And imagine further enforcement of a rule that would require no further deception or funding of deception by those companies. I think we've got to have that image of success. If we don't know what it looks like, we'll never get there. And I believe that we are at a very critical moment here with these suits started. We don't know where they're going to end up, but I think there's every reason to be rooting for their success. So I would ask all of you, you've now been educated about this. Go and educate your friends and your families and explain how it is that fossil fuel companies do have this responsibility. Support the groups and the attorneys who are bringing these suits. Fight efforts, if they arise in the legislature or in Congress, to try to derail these suits with legislation. So I hope you found tonight educational and inspiring. I know I did, and I'd like to close with a special thank you to all the speakers and the panelists.